Morning, everyone. And well, it's morning here. I don't know whether it is in your part of the world. Welcome to this question and answer period of theories of addiction. I think we're in week 6 right now, and this week I am covering motivation and change models. Let me jump into it. I didn't have a huge number of questions, but the questions that I did get are a bit more complicated than the questions that were posed about previous lectures. So let me jump in, and I'll maybe break some of these questions into parts. Also, I noticed that a good number of the people that posed the questions are also practitioners of, or students of, or individuals who are interested in rational emotive behavioral therapy and wanted me to kind of link these motivation and change models to REBT. I can't get into that in a huge way in this question and answer period. That will be a huge part of another course that will be coming up. But I do want to say something about that so that those of you who have that background in REBT will kind of see the way that we're thinking, and then you'll be able to build some of that on your own. But let me jump in, because there was an interesting question about the prime theory, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the prime theory in the first lecture, I believe it was, but they wanted to know, why is it criticized, and do I see any potential link or overlap with REBT? Excellent question. Remember, the prime theory has several parts to it. Those are each of those letters stands for an important word. P stands for plans, which would be the intentions of the client and the kind of cognitive representations they have about how they're going to act. And then response has to do with behaviors, initiating change, or pausing, or stopping, or returning to a particular behavior. So this is behavioral in nature. The I stands for impulse, which means, in this particular model, emotions, urges, and drives, what I would call more push factors to engage in change. And then motives are specifically desires, wants, needs, or what the client perceives as needs. And then the evaluations are evaluative beliefs. Okay. Why is this model criticized? Many people criticize this for being too simplistic, not complex enough, or not comprehensive enough, and just focusing on more internal factors that have to do with motivation rather than extrinsic factors or external factors, which is rather interesting. And as for the overlap with REBT, this is really fascinating for me. That first part of the prime theory, the plans, the intentionalities and cognitive representations, are tied largely to inferences that are made within REBT. So it would be that part of the cognition. Remember, in REBT, the cognitions are inferences and beliefs. This would focus largely on the inferences. The response part has to do with behaviors. And so, of course, in REBT, in the ABC model, we would look at the C would be constituted by behaviors, and we would assess those behaviors as functional or dysfunctional, and those are determined in terms of whether those behaviors are really helping someone attain their goal or move away from that goal. So that's a really important part that is also contained within REBT. Impulses would be the emotions, and of course urges and drives, and motives are also related to that, but the impulse is largely the emotion, which in REBT would be the C, and we would look at dysfunctional emotions versus functional emotions, again, determined by whether they help or hinder an individual in attaining life goals. Motives and evaluations, the M and the E in the prime theory, are about what REBT would call beliefs, where the motives would be desires and wants, which would be, the helpful negative emotions, perhaps, and then evaluations would be more those evaluative beliefs. So if you look, this prime theory does look at the B and the C, and it looks at the A in terms of how it is cognitively represented by the individual. So pretty much overlaps the REBT model considerably. Let's move to the next question. And the individual said, I get what you mean when you say that motivation is purposeful behavior. And but they're saying, I don't understand why that's such an advantage or an improvement over other ways to look at motivation. Again, an excellent question. If we look at motivation as purposeful behavior or behavior with a purpose, I notice that in across these motivation change models, there can be this if-then kind of thinking, that if there is this mental representation that the client has about use of a drug or whatever, then there's the then part would be the image they have about positive expectancy or negative expectancy about what would happen as a result. Remember, positive expectancy are those positive things that an individual with a substance use disorder is anticipating will result from the use of that drug, and the negative expectancies would be the negative consequences. And we know that if there's a large number and very powerful positive expectancies to use the drug, that the individual is more likely to use the drug. And we see that quite a bit in someone who is engaging in a substance use disorder. What is helpful about this idea that seeing motivation as a behavior with a purpose is that we pose particular questions to them that take the place of just viewing the individual with a substance use disorder with respect to motivation as saying, they're just not motivated or they have low motivation. The reality is everybody is motivated. It may not be the motivation that we would like from that individual, but they're motivated to do something. So it's not as though an individual has low motivation. They may not be motivated in the way that we would hope they do. And I think it's kind of pejorative then to say that they have low motivation. It's an overgeneralization about the individual. Or we might say that the individual is in denial about the problem, when they may not be in denial at all. It may be that they're focused on something else, or their focus is on the positive expectancy. And so they're not in denial about that at all. They're highly aware of that. They may not focus on the deleterious consequences of taking the drug. Absolutely. The other thing is that if they're not motivated, seemingly motivated in the direction we think they should be motivated in, that they're engaging in resistance. No, I think, again, that can be real pejorative. And when therapists begin to look at someone as having resistance, we're assuming that the problem is about them, rather than in our work with them. It might not be real helpful to see them as just engaging in resistance, and that's why they're not making the progress that we want them to make. But it is that they are acting out of that positive expectancy and they are motivated in that direction. So this kind of view of motivation as purposeful behavior might have us ask some questions that would move us away from those more pejorative views of the client, like what is the individual, why is this individual taking this particular drug? What's going on there? And then what do they get out of taking that drug? Because if they didn't get something out of it, they wouldn't be doing it. And so I think we need to get inside the cognitive world of that client and try to see what taking that drug would be like from their perspective. What do they hope to get out of it? And the degree to which we understand that, rather than taking a pejorative view of them and saying, you know what, they just have low motivation, they have no desire, they are in denial and they're in resistance, we really get in their head and try to see the issue that would help us then help them make some changes. Good question. The other part of that question that came up was how does that deal with values in the therapy? Well, many of these motivation and change models will tend to see values as a particular kind of motivation. So it's not like it's a different entity altogether, but it's a type of motivation. And it is, a value would be that kind of motivation that is more enduring across time, so that when we're looking at motivations, we might look at motivations for short-term goals, but we could also look at more pervasive motivation across time, and those could be identified as values. Again, excellent questions to consider as we are working with these individuals. Several questions came up about the trans-theoretical model of change, which is also called the stage theory of readiness or motivation. This is largely the model developed by Prochaska and Di Clementi, which, if you remember, has like 7, it's a stage theory, and like all stage theories, it has drawbacks, because when we have stage theories, it's as if there are discrete stages, and stages are not discrete. They're just, they're on a continuum across time whatsoever, and they're not linear, they go. But if we look at the stage theory in that sense, rather than very rigidly predicting where a person is, then we would, I think, have better luck in dealing with it. But the stages, and here again, on a continuum, would begin with a pre-contemplation stage, where there's little awareness that there's any issue or problem at all, to the contemplative stage, where they have developed some awareness, to the planning and preparation stage, where not only do they have awareness, but they have a foot, they're moving toward actually taking action. And then the action stage is where they're taking decisive action toward a goal. Once they've done that and they've pretty well got a handle on the issue with the substance use or whatever, then and they're good, and it's kind of moving. I mean, the behavior is helpful, not that they're good, but the behavior is kind of moving in the direction, in a good supportive direction. Then they move into that maintenance phase, where they've essentially solved the problem, and they're engaging in the maintenance of the skills to try to prevent from going back and embracing the problem. And then the next one, which may or may not happen, but there's a high degree of probability in addiction that we will see it, is the elapsed, relapse, or recycle stage, where the actions are then exemplify the old and dysfunctional behavior that is not really helpful. And then once they work through that, by the way, we would view that not as hugely problematic, although it can have really negative consequences, including death and getting fired and losing friendships and things like that, or family members. What we hope, and the view that we would try to take, is that it's a learning opportunity for the client, so that when they move back into more adaptive behaviors if they have deeper insight as a result of that lapse or relapse. And then finally, termination. That's where the maintenance skills have actually been internalized and the individual has, and it's become habitual. Now, how can we make a link, as someone said, with what RET would do? Can it be applicable to these stages? Well, absolutely. If the individual believes that they have that they have no problem, they don't even have an awareness of a problem, then they may have an inference about individuals saying that they do, or an inference about their actual use. So it'd be really helpful to explore the meaning or the interpretation they give to their use of a particular substance. So a lot of work at the level of the inference. One thing that I often do at that point would be to, well, you say you don't see this as a problem, and if you did see it as a problem, what would you think about yourself? So I can begin to get a sense of what it might mean. If they viewed it as a problem, they may not view it as a problem right then. When we get to the contemplation stage, where I go, yeah, I'm aware that I may drink a bit too much, but it's really not a problem for me. So again, I would look at the inferences that are associated with that, but also again, if it were a problem for you, what would that look like? And how would I know, or anybody else would know that it's a problem, or how would you yourself know that it is a problem? And then also look for the minimization of any of the consequences that they are experiencing as a result of using this substance. When they're at that preparation stage, where they're realizing that they want to take action, I might they've shifted to kind of active readiness. And then I would have some discussions with them about how they perceive any potential obstacles to them acting in a direction that would be helpful for them. So they want to take steps to lower or eliminate the use of a substance. And so I would want to get help them form realistic inferences about possibilities here, to see that there may be some challenges to that, so that we can get ready to address any of those impediments that they encounter. And then when they're active, then we could really begin to, I would say, shift much more toward the beliefs that they are holding, where it's not as though we're ignoring the beliefs that they're holding before, but I want to look at those evaluative cognitions, the beliefs. And especially I want to look at any frustration and intolerance they have about putting that desire to act into action in an ongoing way. And so if there's frustration and intolerance, we probably want to address that pretty quickly, okay? Especially that question may come up when we're looking at obstacles to their attainment of the goal of refraining or lowering the use of the substance. When we get to the maintenance phase, this is where they've already developed some skills that are working for them in some way. And so then I would also begin to look at a more complex set of inferences that they're having, interpretations about environmental triggers. Because sometimes when people are in the maintenance phase, they go, oh, okay, I've got this fully under control, and they may take needless risk or risks that are inordinate, for which they may not be quite prepared to handle. And so we might want to help them look at those potential risks, any frustration and intolerance that they may have, and then also any beliefs that they have about the self that might pop up if they do encounter a problem that they begin to engage in global negative self-rating or global rating of their environment or the world as just way too complicated and difficult to navigate. And then at the relapse and recycle phase, then we need to go back and really begin to look at the potential risks, the risks that they may have taken that weren't helpful, what we can learn from that. How did they assess risk? What were the factors that went into assessing that risk? And then whether any of the dysfunctional beliefs came up and, that this is too much, I can't handle this, I'm fully got this under control with an exaggerated sense of self in this sense. We don't want them to engage in global negative rating, but they may have had an exaggerated sense of self and then evaluated themselves as just totally in control. Well, once we've worked through that, which is a great opportunity to look at their inferences and beliefs and strengthen those beliefs and practice them again, then we can look to see how they do in different situations. In other words, in various activating events and environmental situations, etc., and see whether they're able to do the cognitive restructuring that is necessary and maintain the helpful behavior. At this point, I really like to look at self-attribution and how they identify the self. Do they identify the self as in recovery? Do they identify the self as cured? Do they identify the self, in any number of ways? And what does that mean? So I want to hope they have a sense of not only a healthy sense of identity. The other thing that I do is, and I find this even more important than assessing how they view the self, their identity, but look at the process of identification. What are the factors that go into their sense of identity? Is it the response of other people? Are they particular relevant people that they deem as relevant? What are the factors that contribute to that ongoing process of identification? Thank you. That's a complicated question that had a lot to do because there are lots of overlaps with REBT in that particular trans-theoretical model. Another one, the question had, and it's a very brief one, is intrinsic versus extrinsic factors in motivation. I was saying that it is really important to identify intrinsic factors for clients because those may really help the client successfully address the addictive behavior. And so I didn't want to give the sense that the extrinsic motivation is not important. In fact, often, initially an individual has extrinsic motivation, right? Extrinsic factors in that motivation, extrinsic goals, because they may be ordered by a loved one or an employer or a judge or somebody like that. And so that may be an extrinsic factor, but we hope over time that we uncover some intrinsic motivation factors that would help them be even more resilient. Finally, I want to look at, there were just numerous questions about motivational interviewing, and I don't have time to go over all of this, but I do want to highlight the great overlap between motivational interviewing and REBT and how we can, if we are REBT practitioners and we have clients that have substance use disorders or process or behavioral addictions, how we can integrate motivational interviewing right in with our REBT therapy. One, that is so consistent with REBT is that motivational interviewing is a strengths-based model. In REBT, we try to build upon the strengths that the individual has. We don't see them, we try to take a realistic view of the client. They have some challenges and they have some great strengths, and it's really important to tap into those strengths. And if the client can't see those strengths, that part of what we do as a therapist is point out what we would perceive as strengths. I'll say a little bit more about that a little bit later. The other one is motivational interviewing is fantastic in forming a partnership with the client, a collaborative relationship. That is crucial to REBT. We do not view the therapist as the all-knowing individual, the expert about the client. And what we're going to do is pour knowledge into that client and have them do what we want them to do. That's absolutely not what REBT is about. It is about working with the client toward their desired goals and helping them to have beliefs and behaviors that will help them attain those desired goals. And to do that, we try to work very closely and collaboratively with them. For example, in the very first session, and often in subsequent sessions, we're going to say, what's your goal? What's your goal vis-a-vis whatever you're experiencing right now? And whatever that goal is, we may try to get some clarity around that, or try to tweak it a little bit with their permission, but we are building upon that goal, just very collaborative. It's a partnership. The other thing is that motivational interviewing is bedrock for them, that is also bedrock for REBT, is the therapist attitude toward the client. It is a goal in REBT that the therapist have unconditional acceptance for our client, and we model for them how to have unconditional acceptance for themselves and for others. So again, that's bedrock in REBT. And so that means that we take a very non-judgmental approach toward clients, and even we try to watch the vocabulary that we use so that it doesn't come across as judgmental. For example, in the history of REBT, we often talk about irrational beliefs. And so when I'm working with a client, I won't use the word irrational, because they may think that is kind of pejorative and I'm putting them down. And so instead, I will try to say unhelpful beliefs, or beliefs that tend not to help you reach the goals that you have identified as very important for you. The other one is empathy for the client. And look, we know from the common factors research that if the client perceives the therapist as having empathy for them, that the outcome of therapy is much, much greater. So that's going to be something that we're going to look at consistently, empathy. Fortunately, there's research that even shows that when a client is explaining something that is, that they're experiencing is negative, and certain parts of their brain kind of light up, that if the therapist is empathic, that the same parts of the brain that the client that were lit up in the client are also lit up in the therapist. So also we have these mirror neurons so that we can pick up to some degree the inferences and the beliefs and the actions of the client, because our neurons are triggered that will help us to have empathy for them. So tremendously, tremendously important to have empathy. What about looking for inconsistencies in the talk of the client and the behavior of the client? Motivational interviewing, really, because they want to help the client move away from kind of drug use kind of discussion, or this language that sees themselves as helpless in the face of drug use, to moving toward hope and possibility, and actually moving toward wanting and desiring and even taking steps toward change, having a change attitude, in other words. Well, in RBT, we do the same thing. We will try to look at the discrepancy between what this client says that they're feeling, or they may say, I have no hope, but then they engage in behaviors that look to reveal hope. And so we point this out because the client may be globally looking at, well, let's say they may have confirmation bias. And when they have confirmation bias, they're looking at beliefs and their reactions to things in the environment and in one way and discounting another way. And so they may have even confirmation bias about themselves. They may not be aware, they look at their negative thoughts, but they don't look at their more hopeful and adaptive kinds of thoughts. So we will really look at those discrepancies to point those out and try to get clarity with the client about them, right? Another one, which I really like in motivational interviewing, is asking permission of the client before they offer some kind of response to what the client has said. And I think this, I really like this. I see this as part of respect and collaboration. And in RBT, we would see this as a part of the unconditional acceptance of our client, that we are going to do that. Many people think that in RBT, we're not interested in a therapeutic alliance. We are interested in therapeutic alliance, but we're also interested in common factors research that shows what elements make up the therapeutic alliance, rather than just using a vague phrase like therapeutic alliance. We want to look at those factors that contribute to that. And in fact, once you do look at the common factors research, you see that the factors they have identified as contributed to positive outcomes in the therapy are pretty much built right into RBT, the RBT model and practice that we recommend for therapists. For example, we would refrain from saying, you have a big problem and you need to address this as soon as possible. Well, I think what happens is that we ask for permission, but we do this and we respond in a much better way than that, which because we would look at the fact that if by saying something like that, we would be failing to grasp the complexity and the real motivating factors for that particular client and the positive expectancies they have about their drug use. So it is kind of compassionately and empathetically looking at them and weighing our language to reflect that. The other thing that I like in motivational interviewing that is really important in RBT is that we don't overemphasize the dwelling on the talk that would sustain them in a dysfunctional behavior. So for example, when a client comes in, we wouldn't have, in RBT, we wouldn't just have them tell us everything that went wrong in the week, because then we're just emphasizing and teaching the client how to focus on the negative. What we want to include in there is, tell me what went really well for you this week in moving toward the goal that you were hoping for, or any new insight that you had with respect to the self, others' life, world, and the struggle that you're having, etc. Let's look at that, and any ways that you dealt with an impediment toward action. These things are really helpful, because then we're helping the client begin to have a different kind of confirmation bias. The confirmation bias more toward more positive and adaptive, rather than just the negative that's going in their life. The last thing we want to do with the client is support a problem-saturated narrative that they have, especially a problem-saturated negative narrative about the self and the hopelessness of the self. We don't want them to do that. We don't want to reinforce doing that at all. So we want to help them change that, their talk about even the self, so that it reflects greater and greater awareness of the complexity of the self, but also greater and greater self-acceptance, because they will be much more resilient in the face of some symptoms and substance use disorder that may take a while to recover from. The other thing that that motivational interviewing recommends, that if you're an RDT practitioner, you understand fully, and that is the use of Socratic questioning. This is bread and butter for motivational interviewing, and we do it in RDT. And the reason we do it in RDT, when we are kind of challenging a belief, etc., to try to help them replace that belief so that they better reach their goals, is we will ask it in Socratic question, like, how is this helping you? What do you expect? What do you see as the evidence that supports that belief, etc.? Because it gets more engagement with the client. Now, we don't torture the client. If they're really struggling with Socratic questions, then we may say, well, in my experience with someone who's going what you're going through, some of them may be thinking this. And I always have say with that, that may or may not apply to you, or it may not apply to you fully, or it may apply only partially. What do you think? And then we have a dialogue about that. It can be really helpful. And so I think what we're trying to do in that Socratic questioning is kind of elicit from them a new vision of their life, a new vision of themselves, so that it is more hopeful. Well, I want to finish right there, and I want to thank all of you so much, and I will stay in touch because this upcoming week I have a surgery, and that means I'm not sure whether I will be able to do a question and answer period next Friday, but I will certainly be letting people know on Facebook and in class that whether I will or not. So please say a prayer, keep your fingers crossed that the surgery goes well and I can be with you guys next Friday. Thanks so much, and I thank you for your patience, for hanging in there today. Have a wonderful weekend.